After Linsky died, we had been, those of us that were there, had been thinking about what direction should we go and all of that. We came out with this idea of doing congregational-based organizing. My colleague, Arnie Cortez, was, even though all of us had talked about it, was really the first person to do it. And he put COPS together in San Antonio. It was the first IF organization where the congregations were the institutional members. And it was a great organization, still is. He did a terrific job. And he did so well that the bishop in Los Angeles, Bishop, I think his name was Arzube, had been in conversation with Bishop Flores, who was a Mexican-American bishop in San, had talked to Bishop Arzube, and he wanted something like COPS in LA. So Ernie went to East LA, and I went to COPS in '76. So I followed Ernie there. And it was great for me. Milwaukee was a good experience because I learned how to really put something together from scratch in Milwaukee. But in COPS, when I came, it already had a pretty fair amount of clout in the city. So it was, you learn about how to handle power when you actually have some power. Otherwise you're just studying it.
Yeah.
And COPS had power, and we grew it. I had to learn a lot about power because we had it, and how to wield it and how to try to grow it and how to deal with it was a great learning experience for me, as well as we were accomplishing huge things, wins that I never had accomplished in Milwaukee. We had done well in Milwaukee, but nothing like what was going on in COPS. And so that was just a marvelous experience. And secondly, to me, COPS had the ring of, it had the emotion of movement. It really was the civil rights movement passion for the Mexican-American people in San Antonio. So it had what I strive for in any organizations I work for. It had the soul of a movement and the body of a broad-based. And so it was very passionate and very driven in a good way. And we accomplished a huge amount. And so I found in COPS a way for me how to mesh movement and broad-based, and that they weren't separate. They weren't these siloed things that if you do broad-based, that's it, or broad-based is better than movement, or movement is better than broad-based, or advocacy doesn't have a place. In the early 70s, there was a thing around broad-based organizing that it was better than movement, and movement comes and goes. And I never could buy into that because I'd come out of the movement, and so I knew what we had accomplished in the city. I had only wished that broad-based would have accomplished what the civil rights movement had accomplished. So I couldn't see how you could knock something that changed the whole country when we were, at that time, getting stop signs. How did that compare to what I had been through and the country had been through, really, in the civil rights movement? So I learned that in San Antonio, and I learned also, I think I knew it, but I really learned it. I knew it intellectually, but I got it as social knowledge. I never worked with Mexican-American people before, but Africans, because I had been in the Peace Corps before I went back to organizing. Puerto Ricans, because I'd been teaching high school in New York before I went to organizing. But I never worked with Mexican-Americans. And it just came to me that there are certain universals about human beings that are true for everyone, whether it's a small village in Sierra Leone where I lived, or it was in the civil rights movement in inner city African-American communities, or whether we're now, or when I was teaching predominantly Puerto Rican kids, and whether it was Mexican-American people who come out of a whole different experience. There are certain universals. Those universals are power, self-interest, all these things are universals. But you have to understand the culture of a people to figure out how to apply those to that culture. You couldn't just say that here's a principle, here's a universal, a political universal, and then just apply it in the same way that you would to everybody. The political universal is the same. We've been in South Africa, I've been in England, and wherever I've been, rural, Harlan County, white, poor people. So I've learned that whenever I go to a city, I try to understand the history of the city, the culture of the people, and then try to figure out what's the way to get people to see how best to explain this political universal inside of their experience, and where in their culture is it. When I went to San Antonio, since I was Jewish and I didn't know I thought there was one book. I didn't know anything. And this is congregationally based. It was predominantly Catholic at the time. So I went to the seminary, and I studied synoptics, the Gospels, in Texas.
Yeah.
So I could understand, because this was 33 congregations, 32 Catholic and 1 Episcopal. And it's congregationally based, and they're using a lot of scripture, which I'm totally unfamiliar with. And I don't know, I'd been to very few masses at that point. I've been to some, because in Milwaukee I went to a few. But the mass in San Antonio, being in Spanish and having Mexican flavor, and the importance of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and all of that
Certain kind of music as well.
Processions. It was all different to me. So I knew that I had to understand that. So I went to the Mexican American Cultural Center, and I had to learn as much as I could about the background of Mexico and Mexican Americans coming here and Mexican American culture. And I went to the seminary to take classes. So I learned the importance of having to dig in and understand the culture of a people before you just say, okay, here are the 10 commandments of organizing, and you'll do them, and then you'll be successful. You can't do it that way. I learned it in Harvard.
Doesn't work.
No, you wouldn't. How I went about organizing amongst poor whites in rural Kentucky couldn't be the same way that I did it in a barrio, although some of the principles were the same about power. And San Antonio was a great experience for me, and I left organizing for 2 years after that. I went to teach at San Jose State. My wife and I taught in the faculty of San Jose State and School of Social Work from 78 to 80. 80, I came back to the IAF to organize BUILD, or to try to resurrect BUILD. It had started in 77 while I was leaving, and then it had flopped, basically. Chambers, the director of IAF, wanted me to go to Baltimore, because it was the first city that was predominantly African American.
Yeah.
We had been in since the early fight days in Rochester, and it had been essentially a failure. And then IAF came to Buffalo after I left in '66, and then the Black Power movement came in, and the OEO hired many of the organizers for better salaries than we had, and we were out of black communities. And then Linsky decided to try to organize middle class and working class white people. And so all of our thrust was, like the CAP organization in Chicago was working class white people and so forth, middle class white people.
I was there during that period.
Paul Booth and Father Dugan were the co-chairs, okay. And so this was the first city back into the African American community. We were getting known for our work in Mexican American communities, COPS, UNO in LA, where Ernie was. And we didn't want to be seen just as the Catholic Mexican American network.
And Baltimore definitely was not.
No, there were no Mexicans. So it was predominantly black city. It's always had a large African American population. So they started it up. They didn't start it up well, IF that is, and then it was floundering by 80, and it had debt, and it was going to go under. And Ed asked me if I would go to Baltimore and see if we couldn't rebuild it, because we were putting a sponsoring together in Brooklyn, which became EBC, where we did Nehemiah. And those pastors, African American pastors, since we didn't have a track record in predominantly African American cities for 15, 20 years, so that these black pastors then would not know of the people who were involved with us back then. Just didn't know who we were and weren't sure of us at all. And they were talking to pastors in Baltimore who were saying, I don't think this thing works really. Good theory, or interesting theory. But I went to Baltimore, and what I did was, because it was in heavy debt, and there were only like 10 or 11 congregations left involved, and it started out biracial, but by then both white and African American congregations had left, because it hadn't performed. It hadn't done anything bad. It just hadn't performed. There were just a few, predominantly, mostly, not all, but mostly African American congregations left. And so when I got there, it was so deeply in debt, more debt than I had realized, actually. I may not have come
to this work.
That's right. I don't know that I would have gone there if I realized that, because the figures that were given to me when I was being interviewed were not actually the right figures. At any rate, when I went there, the only thing I could think to do to have it survive, because we only had 2-3 months money left, was to turn it into a movement. Didn't have time to, because if I said house meetings, they'd already done that and it had failed, and there was no energy. So we started going against the banks, and bringing people downtown and disrupting banks because they weren't lending money. You could get all that stuff because of CRA information.
That fit into that.
And so we got a lot of energy going around, because at that time in 1980 you wouldn't see a lot of African American people protesting at a downtown bank. City's a funny city, Baltimore. It's eastern, but it's southern. Because
Yeah.
it's Maryland, so it's a border state. So it has eastern feel to it because it's a port city, and it has had many ethnic white people there, as well as always a large African-American population. But it didn't desegregate until into the 60s or whatever, and 50s. It's a funny state in that way. I never thought of it as southern, but I learned that
But
it
it
has.
feels like it.
Yes. So we did a whole series of movement actions against insurance companies, for discrimination, against the power company, BG&E, and that got us going and revived the build. Then I had to try to figure out, all of us did, how to take this movement. It had the soul now of a movement, but I had to get the body of a broad base because it wouldn't last if it was just that.
Did you find it more difficult in the African American community to move inside each congregation and build from there?
And
Than in the-
cops?
Yeah, cops.
Both places presented me with racial difficulty, right? Because people loved Ernie Cortez in San Antonio. Right? He's Mexican-American, he's brilliant, he's from San Antonio. All of the things they had experienced in a discriminatory way, Ernie had experienced
Experienced it
himself and his family. And he's really a brilliant guy, and so they were so proud of Ernie and all that he had accomplished. And for me to come in, white, Jewish, was a hard
Challenge.
pill to swallow for them.
Yeah.
They hired me eventually after going through a kind of torturous interview process that had to come back twice. But that which I experienced racially there was not too dissimilar to what I experienced in going into black congregations as a white person. So
Yeah.
both had to overcome animosity towards white people, or at least mistrust of white people in both situations. So that was somewhat similar. But when I went to Baltimore, I did the same thing that I did when I went to San Antonio. I found a pastor who I worked hard to get a relationship with, because first he wasn't too trusting of a white person, but he turned out to be a wonderful mentor in my life, maybe one of the most important people in my life, a man named Reverend Vernon Dobson, who he's retired now, was the pastor of Union Baptist Church, the second oldest black Baptist church in the city. Had been involved in the civil rights movement, had known Dr. King. It took us about 6 months for him to trust me. But then I asked him to mentor me. So he started I went to black churches almost every Sunday to get different ones, to get feel for the different worship services. And then he started me in directed reading in black theologians about black preaching, homiletics, and then started bringing me around the School of Religion at Howard, where I met the dean, got to know him. Actually wound up teaching a class there. And so I tried to steep myself as much as I could, both in the history of Baltimore, which has a very interesting and unique history, and in the history and the life of the black church. Because in core, I didn't know the black church. Core was really anti-church. Saw the church as negative and preaching people into the next life and all of that. So don't worry about this life. And there was a heavy feeling anti-black pastor, black preacher, black church. So I didn't know black pastors in core. They stayed away from the preachers. So I just did what I did in San Antonio, or did what I did when I went to Harlan County and was organizing in Harlan County and coal country and rural whites, when I was for a while working for welfare rights.
Oh, that was with welfare rights?
Yeah,
Got it.
I was there for about 5 months. It was part of a field placement when I was in graduate school, West Virginia. They were on a block placement, so I was just there for 5 months. I wasn't in school, and that's where I wanted to go to learn, because it was a thing I knew nothing about, rural white people. I was just wanting to figure that out, or at least expose myself to it.
And that was also during the Black Power days, right?
That was after. See, from college, I went to the Peace Corps.
Gotcha.
From Peace Corps, I came back and I started school and graduate school. I dropped out. When I dropped out of graduate school, I was teaching kids in the New York Public City school system. The school system ended that program, placed me in a high school, which was an inner city school. It really wasn't in the inner city, but it had all the kids from East Harlem went there. The location wasn't, but the school itself was made up of kids from the inner city. Then I went to graduate school in West Virginia, and as part of my education, I talked them into letting me go for 5 months for a semester to Harlan County, because I wanted to learn, just see what that was like. Go up in the hollers, and then I came back to, then It was a professor there that introduced me to Alinsky, and that's how I wound up in the IAF in '71, after I got my MSW. So basically I did the same thing in Baltimore. I used movement to get it off the ground, to rebuild it, and I worked real hard to learn the culture and get the feel for black church culture and to understand the history of the city and to read a lot. So I read a lot of Howard Thurman and James Cone and Henry Mitchell and a whole series of African-American writers on the church, the black church experience. And for a year or more, I was in different churches most every Sunday.